I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon. I'm going to read to you from the book of Exodus in the 21st chapter. I'm only reading 2 verses. These are Exodus 21 and verses 28 and 29. Now, if a bull ox gores a man or a woman, killing them, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of that ox shall go unpunished. If, however, a bull ox had been known to have the habit of goring, and its owner had been warned, yet the owner does not confine it, and that bull ox kills a man or a woman, then the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. You may be seated. My wife usually goes to bed a little before me, so a lot of times I'll stay up and watch a little TV. So I'd watch something on TV. Now this is, there wasn't a lot of cable stuff happening back then, but there was a show, I think it was called Hard Copy. I think that was what it was. It had like Bill O'Reilly. And so Bill O'Reilly on this show was interviewing a man whose name was Tom, and he was a convicted murderer and was on death row in Nevada. And he actually this was the last interview before his execution. And he'd gone on a murder spree. So he had a bunch of people that he just decided he was going to kill, and he went ahead and killed them. So he killed a bunch in one place, and then he went somewhere else and killed a bunch more. And O'Reilly was sort of asking him about this, and he had his reasons why those people needed to die and why he needed to kill them. By the way, you see me doing this is because he murdered them with a knife. And then Bill O'Reilly said, well, what about... So was a woman who worked at a small airport in that area. I think it handled commercial planes and small planes. And she had gotten off work for the day and had walked over to her car. So she was going through the parking lot when he came along. And he looked at Bill O'Reilly, and I remember this. He seemed, you know how sharks have those really dead eyes and it's kind of creepy? That's what I saw when I looked at this guy. I'm like, oh, man. But he said, oh, she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I knew, I'd only met her a couple times, but her parents were part of my church. She had grown up in a church I was serving. I'm the one who did her funeral. So when I was watching this, it was personal, right? And there's no way you can think about a situation like that and think, why didn't God intervene? I mean, for crying out loud, if she had spilled her coffee and needed to clean it up and just been, 30 seconds or a minute later going out to her car. Or if one of her coworkers had said, I'm going to finish up here, why don't you go home? And she'd been a minute earlier going out to her car, it would have been a different outcome. Why wasn't there some intervention? Why didn't something different happen? And that's a question that's really impossible to answer. I mean, in a way that makes sense to our hearts. We can come up with our theological reasons, but down here, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. The law in the Bible, in the Torah, looks like a lot of law in the ancient world. It's very comparable to what we see in other cultures in the Mideast. The scholars like to make comparisons between the Ten Commandments and stuff with the laws of Hammurabi, and so historians and scholars are wondering, okay, you want to put the Ten Commandments in the school, first, which version? But more importantly, why not also the laws of Hammurabi, which are, part of that same ethos, part of that source material. Why not include that? So the laws are very common kinds of things, but some of the laws are case law, right? That they're not like legal principles. Like there's a legal principle, thou shalt not commit murder, right? That's a legal principle. But this is a specific, this happened apparently at some point. There was a bull ox that gored somebody and killed him, and then the bull ox, there was some history there or something, and they had rendered a judgment around this story, this situation. My guess is that they had already had the habit of not holding someone accountable for the behavior of an animal, but in this case there was that, what do we call it, negligent homicide, that the owner had been negligent in taking care of mitigating this risk. And so they had to adjudicate this one, and they had to make a distinction between this particular case and other cases. So this is case law. And so anytime you read like a really weird law and you're like, that seems oddly specific, that's why. It's case law. But case law provides precedent and is used to render other kinds of determinations. And this case law may have been an Israelite case, or it may have been one they borrowed from somewhere else, because the law that we receive, the way it comes to us, it's actually got a couple of different components to it. One part is the part, the covenant with God, the part Moses gets, right? And then over time, under the leadership of Moses and later Israelite leaders, more law gets added and informed to kind of form a corpus of understanding. And then when it gets written, it's got kind of all brought together in this interesting way. And so you see these laws, and there's a reason for them. They're there. And so there's this situation that comes up, and then there's this judgment about being responsible for or not responsible for something that occurs by virtue of how someone cares for a potential threat in their world. And this still goes on today. I mean, like the pit bull that has bitten a bunch of people and then actually bites someone so badly that they're either permanently maimed or killed, right? And then everyone's like, well, why didn't you do something about the pit bull? And then how is that person held responsible for that? How are they held accountable for that? Yeah, the pit bull will get put down as one that's attacked a human being, but how is a person who was not taking proper precautions with that pit bull after previous events, how are they held accountable? So that still goes on today. This kind of law this kind of issue is still an issue for us today. And so here it is in the text as well. Here it is in the story. Because, the question is, who's responsible for this bull, right? Who's responsible for this bull? This thing came and killed somebody. Who's responsible for this bull? And that's a really legitimate question. Now, you walk into any situation, you've had this experience where everything's a complete disaster and people are yelling and screaming and there's maybe arguing happening, and you're like, who's responsible for this bull? And we mean it in a slightly different but really the same way. Because we look at this situation and we know that there's something about the situation that maybe the immediate or direct moment cause is like, we got to deal with that, but there's another thing behind that led to that. Yeah, there's a bull goring people, but behind that bull, there's an owner, so there's something else going on. So I want to remind you that in the book of Genesis, we have two different creation stories. And the second creation story is the story where God creates the first human being, the Adam, and then how that Adam alone doesn't work, and God draws from the side of the Adam a second human being in such a way that you now, instead of having the human being, you now have an Adam and an Eve. And it's a really cool story. And then God puts them in the garden to take care of the garden. The job of the human beings is to take care of God's garden. Both first and second story of Genesis, both creation stories make that point, slightly different ways, but they both say the same thing. Look outside, we're responsible for that. So they're in the garden to take care of the garden and to enjoy the blessings of the garden at the same time. That's their job. There they are. And then God adds this one tree and says, oh, by the way, don't eat of that one thing. You can have anything else. And you know the story. The serpent comes along. Says, wait a second. Did God really tell you that if you ate of it, you would die? Well, what God said, it's like literally that, but means something more like the day you eat it, you're doomed, right? You're doomed. And so, did God really say that? And then the serpent says this, it has the power to help you know the difference between what is good and what is harmful. Could be good for you to have that kind of knowledge. And then it says that Eve looked at the thing and she was like, oh, that looks tasty. So she never goes as deep, but like the serpent's conversation is about like this sort of profound insight into the nature of knowing and responsibility, and you can know what is harmful and what is beneficial. And she just goes, that looks tasty. And then she has a bite, and she says, it is tasty. And she gives some to Adam, and he eats it. And at this point, they become aware of things they hadn't been aware of before. They become aware of brokenness and shame. They become aware of disobedience. They become aware of the things they want to hide and pretend aren't true, and they go hide themselves from God. And when God comes by and speaks, and the story's wonderful. I love how the story goes because it depicts God walking through a garden. God is walking through a garden, and God is calling out for the gardener, who is Adam. Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm over here hiding in the trees because we knew you were coming, and we are naked and ashamed. And God says, who told you that you were naked? Did you eat that fruit? And I love Adam's response. Well, the woman you made gave it to me. And then God looks at Eve and says, okay, what's your story? The serpent tricked me. But who made the serpent? Who made the woman and the man separate from a single human being? Who put the dang tree in the garden in the first place? God didn't have to put the tree in the garden. God put the tree in the garden and then says, you can eat anything but that tree, right? I mean, God didn't have to put the tree in the garden. God could have left the tree out. Wait a second. Adam undersold it. He did. He should have said, the woman you made gave it to me from the tree you made and put in the garden, right? God, he could have kept going. And plus, you made it possible for me to eat it by making it tasty, smell good, and look good. And you made it so I could choose in the first place. It's your fault. Because ultimately, that's what Adam is trying to get at. And there's a whole theological understanding in the world of theology based on that exact concept. It says that God chooses us to be who we are and how we are. God chooses the things that we do. God controls everything. Nothing happens except that God intends it to happen. And God picks, what's interesting is this is the way they get there is that they backstory this. They start out with, well, God chooses the ones who are going to be saved. And then somebody goes, wait a second. So God is choosing who's going to be saved. Doesn't that mean by default God is also choosing those who are not going to be saved? Well, yeah, but we don't want to talk about that. But yes. Okay. But then doesn't that also mean that God chose the reason that someone needed saving or not saving in the first place? Well, yeah, but we don't want to talk about that. And it's got a fancy name in theology. It's called supralapsarianism. But what it boils down to is God made us this way. We do bad stuff. God made us this way. So why do we go to hell, right? For stuff we do if God's behind it? There's a thing in business that's really interesting. It's a business idea. I don't know if you know this, but you don't quit a job, you quit a boss. You ever heard that? Yes, you quit a boss. I have known so many people whose story was they love their job, they've loved where they work, they've loved their coworkers, then they get a new boss who like does everything possible to flip everything upside down and make it icky, and then they leave. And it's like, okay, I get it. We do not leave the job, we leave the boss. So there's a principle of business that goes something like this. The bad boss delegates responsibility, but retains authority. In other words, the bad boss says, this is your job, but you have to check with me first before you do anything. And if there's a problem come up, better talk to me about it, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. You better fix it the way I say. But if it gets screwed up, it's your fault. You're the one whose job is on the line. That's what the bad boss does. Now, theologically, that's what these people who are doing this kind of theology are saying, essentially, that God is the bad boss who says, you're responsible for the sins you commit, but you can't not commit them because that's how I made you, and I'm the only one who gets to decide who gets saved or not. So, but we're going to blame you for it if you find yourself under judgment. We're going to blame you, but you didn't have the authority to do anything different. And then there's this other thing that comes along, the other way of thinking, where the good boss delegates authority but while retaining responsibility. So what the good boss does is they say, you have the authority to act, to make decisions, to do appropriate things. Here are the parameters within which you act. And anytime you get you have to step outside of maybe these parallel lines that represent your levels of authority, come talk to me. But anything you do in there, you just fix it. But if it goes wrong, the boss takes responsibility for it. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the employee is off the hook. So you can have the employee who abuses their situation, they embezzle money from a client or something like that, and they end up being fired. Yes, they're still held accountable for their actions, but the boss takes responsibility for those outcomes by making sure to make restitution and stuff like that. So that's what the good boss does in comparison with the bad boss. And if you think of God that way, and you think of it, see, God gives Adam and Eve the choice. God gives them authority to choose. God gives us authority to choose, makes us what's called a moral agent. God makes it possible for us to choose good and harm, right and wrong, blessing and cursing. God makes that possible for us, invites us, choose life that you might live, gives us the opportunity to make that choice. That's what God does. God gives us those choices, but if God is giving us the choice to do blessing, God is also giving us the choice to curse. That means that God is giving us the choice, the authority, the power to commit evil, just as much as God gives us the power to commit good. And so you walk into the world and you look around at all of the things that are going on, and you see free will behind it. You see a crazy guy like making a decision, a choice that he's going to murder some people for whatever crazy reason he has in his head for why they deserve it. But when it comes across a simply random woman decides that she's in the wrong place at the wrong time, might as well murder her too. That's a choice he made, a free will choice. That God gave him the choice. God gave him the choice. God gives us that freedom, that authority. Didn't God know ahead of time? Right? I mean, isn't that a foreseeable danger? Like, I'm going to give you guys free will. Isn't it foreseeable what's going to happen? In fact, God seems to love free will. The whole universe seems designed to make room for free will. If you made a different kind of universe, the perfect universe, there'd be no room for free will. It's this kind of messy quantum universe that we live in, that where free will can actually occur, that's the kind of universe God made. God seems to really value free will. God says, I'm choosing free will. I'm giving you guys free will. Couldn't God see what was coming? Couldn't God tell? And if that's the case, if God could tell, then isn't God ultimately responsible for this bull? In other words, isn't God exactly on the deepest theological level who is being spoken of here in this law. But what do you see God doing as a result? God is the good boss who takes responsibility. That, my friends, is what the cross is all about. This obligation, this accountability for all of the pain and the hurt and the world, God doesn't say, well, I'm sorry I gave you free will, but the consequences are yours. Because there's another kind of boss, the kind of boss who delegates authority and responsibility and goes like this, don't look at me. I was in the Caymans counting my money. God doesn't do that either. God says, yes, you have the authority to choose, even badly, but I'm going to take responsibility for it all. On the cross, and in the cross, in the death of Jesus on that cross, God takes everything, all of it, on. And this is what makes it possible for us to still have the freedom to choose. Because here's the thing about life and behavior. When we keep doing things over and over again, we become trapped by the things we do. You've heard me say this, right? The principle of free will that we've talked about in the book of Exodus, that you become what you do until you do only what you become. But once you get to that place, what can break you free of that? What is the grace that makes it possible to choose God, to say yes to God, even though you might never say yes to God? What makes it possible for you to say yes to God is that God has taken responsibility for it all on the cross in order to shake and break that power that all those choices have over us. So yeah, God gave us free will, and God knew there would be a goring. But God chose anyway. And God took responsibility for it anyway. And God redeems anyway. And that's why, as that hymn says, it is in the cross of Christ that I glory. Can you find the prayer of response? Let's pray that together. You, O God, are the one who gave me the authority to act as a free moral agent, entrusting to me the capacity to do good and to do evil. And you knew all along what I would do with this freedom. You knew the harm that I would inflict and the harm that would be inflicted on me by others. You knew that there would be a goring, and you bestowed freedom anyway. You are responsible for this bull. Yet when things went wrong, as you knew they would, you bore the burden of it all upon a cross. You granted authority and retained responsibility, and in this way, you invite me to exercise my freedom by choosing grace. Lord, I choose grace. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for in-person worship Sunday morning at 8:30 at Christ United Methodist, or Sunday morning at 10:15 at Stanton United Methodist. And if Sunday morning is not your jam, join us Monday night, 6 o'clock at Christ United Methodist for Pizza Church. It's church, and then we eat pizza. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
Perfect peace. Oh.